started with a phone call. A simple, unexpected ring that shattered the quiet of my apartment. The voice on the other end was weak, almost a whisper, and yet it sent a shiver down my spine. "She's not well," my mother said, her tone heavy with worry. "Granny's asking for you. Just one night. Please." I hadn't seen Granny in years. Not since I was a child. Her house, an old looming Victorian structure, was a place of unsettling memories. Dark hallways, flickering lights, whispers in the night. Even as a kid, I knew something wasn't right. But she was family, and family obligations have a way of pulling you back, no matter how much you resist. So, against my better judgment, I packed a bag and drove down the winding, desolate road to Granny's house. I should have turned back the moment I arrived. Buddy. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its towering silhouette casting jagged shadows under the dim moonlight. The wooden porch creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the silence. I hesitated before knocking. Granny opened the door before I could. She looked wrong. Her frail frame was hunched, her skin pale and almost translucent. Her eyes, once sharp and kind, now seemed hollow. But it was her smile that unsettled me the most. Too wide, too forced, as if her lips had forgotten how to move naturally. "You came," she rasped. Something in her voice made my stomach twist, but I forced a smile and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and something else, something metallic. The dim lighting cast eerie shadows across the faded wallpaper, and the air felt thick, suffocating. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked too loudly, each chime vibrating in my bones. "Your room is ready," Granny said, shuffling toward the stairs. I followed her up, my footsteps hesitant. The second floor was worse. The walls seemed different, warped, as if the house was breathing, shifting. I brushed the thought away, blaming exhaustion. My room was just as I remembered. Small, cold, and filled with furniture too old for comfort. The bed, an antique four-poster, stood against the wall, its wooden frame carved with strange, intricate symbols. I had never noticed them before. "Sleep well," Granny murmured before shutting the door behind her. The lock clicked. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. The night begins. The silence was oppressive. Every creak, every distant rustle sent my heart racing. The house was old, I told myself. Old houses make noise. Then I heard it. A whisper. A raspy. Right outside my door. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if someone was testing it. "Granny!" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Slowly, I crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the knob, hesitating. Then, gathering my courage, I yanked it open. The hallway was empty. The flickering light bulb overhead buzzed faintly, casting elongated shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. I swallowed hard, stepping out cautiously. A cold draft swept through the corridor, carrying with it a faint, familiar scent, something I couldn't quite place. I turned toward Granny's room, expecting to see her door closed. It wasn't. It was wide open. The bed was empty. The sheets rumpled, as if someone had left in a hurry. And then I saw them. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading away from the bed, out into the hallway. They glistened under the dim light, smeared as if the person had been dragging their feet. I followed them, my breath shallow, my skin prickling with unease. They led downstairs into the darkness below. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The basement door. As I descended, the air grew colder, heavier. The house felt alive. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath me, the walls seeming to press inward. Then, I noticed the footprints veering left, toward a door I had never seen before. Basement door. My hands felt clammy as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold, almost painful to the touch. The moment I turned it, a gust of stale air rushed out, carrying a putrid stench, rotting wood, decay, something worse. My instincts screamed at me to turn back. But something deeper, some morbid curiosity, compelled me forward. The basement stairs stretched into the abyss, each step groaning under my hesitant weight. Shadows pooled at the bottom, thick and suffocating. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to pierce the darkness. And then I saw her. Granny. She stood at the far end of the basement, her back to me. Her nightgown hung loosely, her long, stringy hair draping over her shoulders. Granny! My voice cracked. She didn't move. I took a step closer. The floor beneath me felt damp, sticky. I pointed my light downward, and nearly choked on a scream. The footprints. They weren't water. They were blood. And they didn't belong to Granny. Leave, Granny's voice rasped. But it wasn't coming from her mouth. Came from the shadows behind me. A cold breath brushed against my neck. Turned. Nothing. When I looked back at Granny, she was facing me now. Her eyes were wrong, completely black, soulless voids. Her mouth twisted into that same too-wide smile. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. And then the lights went out. The basement trap. The darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment I stood frozen, heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The damp air in the basement clung to my skin, thick with the stench of decay. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate breath. Not mine. The phone's flashlight flickered, struggling against the suffocating blackness. I swung it wildly, my pulse spiking as I caught glimpses of movement, shadows shifting, something crawling. Granny! My voice barely made it past my throat. No answer. Then the whisper came again. Well, you all didn't. But this time it didn't come from Granny. Came from the ceiling. I tilted my head up. Two glinting black eyes stared back at me from the rafters. A face, pale, grotesquely stretched, grinned down with a mouth that was too wide, too sharp. Limbs, unnaturally long and twisted, clung to the wooden beams, its fingers digging into the rotten wood with a sickening crack. It wasn't human, and it was crawling toward me. My breath caught. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. Then slam. Force shoved me forward. The phone flew from my hands, the light spinning wildly before landing with the screen up, casting eerie shadows. Granny was gone. But the thing on the ceiling was still there, moving faster, its joints cracking with every unnatural twitch. I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping on the blood-smeared floor. My phone's light flickered, then died. Total darkness. Something cold and clawed grazed my ankle. Bolted. The escape, or so I thought. I sprinted blindly, crashing into walls, groping for the stairs. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, overlapping voices murmuring nonsense, until one word cut through them all. Run! I reached the staircase, practically throwing myself upward. My knees banged against the wooden steps, splinters digging into my skin, but I didn't care. I could hear it behind me, scraping, dragging, that awful chittering sound. I lunged for the basement door. A shrill, distorted giggle echoed behind me. The hairs on my arms rose as I felt something right behind me. I banged on the door, screaming. Let me out! The whisper was right in my ear now. Then suddenly the door burst open. I tumbled forward onto the hallway floor, gasping. The moment I looked up, my stomach turned to ice. Granny stood over me. But something was wrong. Her eyes were pitch black. Her face, once frail and old, looked stretched, as if her skin was barely clinging to something underneath. Did you see it? She asked, her voice no longer her own. I scrambled backward, shaking. What is? She took a step closer. The floor beneath her feet groaned, but it wasn't just the wood. It was as if something inside her was moving. You need to leave, she whispered, almost regretfully. Before it takes you to. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in sheer terror. And then bang. The grandfather clock chimed. Granny's face twisted in pain. She clutched her head, her body convulsing. The shadows around us flickered violently, the air vibrating with an unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence returned. Granny collapsed to the floor. I stared, unable to breathe, as the house itself seemed to settle. The air remained thick, but whatever had been lurking in the shadows had vanished. Now, the truth begins to unfold. I hesitated before crawling toward Granny. Her breathing was shallow, her frail chest rising and falling erratically. Whatever had taken hold of her was, at least for the moment, gone. "Granny," I whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, and this time they were normal. Still sunken with age, but no longer that abyss of blackness. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You should have never come back," she rasped. I swallowed hard. "What is this place? What's happening?" Her gaze darted toward the basement door, then back to me. "It's not the house," she whispered. "It's him." Cold shiver ran through me. "Who?" Granny coughed, struggling to speak. Finally she forced out the words that would change everything. "The man in the walls." My skin crawled. I turned, instinctively scanning the dimly lit hallway. The wallpaper, old and peeling, seemed to pulse under the flickering lights, as if something was shifting behind it. Watching. Waiting. "Granny, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. She shook her head. "You don't understand. You can't just leave. He won't let you." The air grew colder. From somewhere inside the house, inside the very walls, came a slow, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails dragging against wood. My breath hitched. The sound was getting closer. Granny's grip tightened. "Whatever happens tonight, don't listen to him. No matter what he says." I didn't get the chance to ask what she meant, because at that moment the lights cut out, and the whispers started again. The darkness spreads. The lights were gone. The whispers thickened in the air, surrounding us like an invisible fog. It was no longer just one voice. There were dozens, overlapping, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Some were soft, almost pleading. Others were angry, their guttural tones dripping with something far more sinister. The tapping inside the walls grew louder, closer. Then I heard it. A low, rasping breath, just inches from my ear. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. My phone was still in the basement, lost in the darkness. No light, no escape. Granny clutched my arm. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was firm. "Stay still," she whispered. The voices faltered, as if listening. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. Something was waiting. Then, from the far end of the hallway, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps began. Blick, blick, blick. Not hurried, not stumbling, just patient, calculated. I squinted into the darkness, but I didn't need to see to know. Someone was coming. Or rather, something. The warning. "Granny," I breathed. "We need to move." She squeezed my arm harder. "If you run, he'll chase you," she whispered. "If you hide, he'll find you." I swallowed the rising panic in my throat. "Then what do we do?" She exhaled shakily. "You listen." My pulse roared in my ears as the footsteps drew closer. The shadows shifted unnaturally, elongating along the walls. Then a voice. "Hello. Won't. Come closer." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. The voice wasn't coming from in front of us. It was coming from inside the walls. I could hear it breathing. I could feel it. Granny's voice was barely audible. "No matter what he says, you do not speak to him." Blick, blick. The footsteps stopped, right in front of us. A long, suffocating silence followed. Knock, knock, knock. A slow, deliberate tapping against the wooden panels beside me. Something was inside. It knocked again, and then. A thin, pale hand slipped through a crack in the wall. It stretched out toward me, its fingers impossibly long, the knuckles bending at inhuman angles. The nails were blackened, jagged. It flexed, twitching as if adjusting to the open air. Then that voice again. "I know you see me." I bit down hard on my tongue to keep from screaming. Granny gripped my wrist. "Turn around. Now." I did. The moment I did, the knocking turned violent. Rapid. Desperate. A barrage of fists pounding against the walls from every direction. The whispers became shrieks, wails of agony and rage. But Granny didn't move. She just stood there, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent prayer. And then, silence. The air shifted, thick with something unseen. And a single whisper slithered through the darkness. Run! The escape attempt. Granny yanked my arm, dragging me down the hallway. My legs barely worked, numb with terror, but I forced them forward. The house groaned as if alive, the very walls trembling. The floorboards curled at the edges, peeling away. The shadows on the ceiling stretched toward us, long fingers grasping at empty air. We reached the stairs. Granny hesitated. The front door was in sight, but something was wrong. The floor beyond the stairs wasn't the same. It looked distorted, warped like a reflection in rippling water. Granny's grip tightened. "He's changing the house," she said, voice hollow. "He doesn't want us to leave." A chill spread through my bones. "But we can leave, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, and that terrified me more than anything else. Then bang. The basement door slammed open behind us. A deep, guttural scraping sound echoed through the house, like something huge dragging itself across the floor. Granny shoved me toward the stairs. "Run!" Bolted. We flew down the steps, our feet barely touching the wood. The shadows around us twisted unnaturally, bending toward us like they were alive. We reached the front door. I grabbed the handle. Twisted. No. I rattled it violently. "It won't open." Granny pressed her palm against the wood, whispering something under her breath. A breath of cold air crept down my spine. Then, from behind us, turned. And there he was. The man in the walls. The horror revealed. He stood in the hallway, half emerged from the cracked wooden panels. His body was all wrong. His limbs were too thin, his fingers impossibly long. His skin was stretched too tight over jagged bones, his mouth an unnatural grin that split too far across his face. His eyes, empty black pits, locked onto mine. And he laughed. Sickening wet sound. Then he moved. Not walked. Glided. His body melted into the walls, shifting, crawling inside them, reappearing inches closer with every flicker of the dim light. I screamed. Granny grabbed my hand. "We have to go now." "But the door." She didn't answer. Instead, she did something I never expected. She turned toward the mirror in the hallway. And she stepped into it. One moment she was there. The next she was inside the reflection. She reached out to me. "It's the only way." I hesitated. Behind me, the man in the walls let out a slow, delighted sigh. And then he lunged. I had no choice. I grabbed Granny's hand. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me was his grin. Stretched, hungering. A world of reflections. I couldn't breathe. The moment Granny shoved me through the mirror, it felt like I was falling through ice. Cold, suffocating, endless. My body twisted, weightless, as if I were sinking into something that wasn't quite air, wasn't quite water. I landed. Hard. The impact sent shockwaves through my bones, and I gasped, dragging in a breath that burned my lungs. I was no longer in Granny's house. But I hadn't escaped either. The other side. I pushed myself up, blinking against the dim light. The world around me was wrong. It looked like Granny's house. Same walls, same creaky wooden floors, but everything was off. The colors were duller, washed out, as if the life had been drained from them. The air was heavy, thick with an eerie silence. And the worst part, everything was mirrored. The furniture was reversed. The hallway curved in the wrong direction. Even my own reflection in a nearby glass cabinet was distorted, lagging behind my movements. A sick feeling curled in my stomach. I wasn't just in another room. I was in another version of the house. A reflection of reality. Prison. Where is Granny? I spun around, my heart racing. Granny! Nothing. Just silence. I ran through the hallway, my footsteps too loud in the stillness. Doors stood slightly ajar, shadows creeping beneath them. My reflection flickered in every surface, slightly delayed, slightly wrong. A whisper. Low. Raspy. Not Granny's. You don't belong here. A shiver shot through my spine. The voice came from behind me, but I didn't dare turn. I knew what I would see. The man in the walls. Watching. Waiting. The figures in the glass. I walked forward, slow, deliberate. I wouldn't let him see my fear. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long. The walls seemed to curve inward, as if the house itself was bending. Then I saw them. Figures. Trapped inside the mirrors. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Their hands pressed against the glass, their eyes pleading. My stomach turned. Were they, like me? Had they been trapped here too? One of them moved. A woman with hollow eyes. Her lips formed silent words. Help us! I stumbled back. A shadow passed behind the glass. Low. Watching. The man in the walls. His grin stretched too wide. And then, he stepped through. Nowhere to run. I turned and ran. Doors slammed shut as I passed, mirrors warping, twisting, reflecting things that weren't really there. The house was shifting. Corridors stretched endlessly. Staircases spiraled in the wrong direction. I wasn't supposed to be here. And the house knew it. A whisper slithered through the air. She traded herself for you. I skidded to a stop. Whoa. No, that couldn't be true. Granny had pushed me through the mirror. She was still there. Wasn't she? She belongs to us now. Asterisk. My blood turned to ice. Turned slowly. And there, in the largest mirror at the end of the hallway, Granny. Her hands were pressed against the glass. Her eyes wide with fear. She was screaming, but I couldn't hear her, because she was on the other side. And behind her, the man in the walls. His grin was wider than ever. The final choice. My heart pounded. I ran toward the mirror, pressing my hands against it. Granny! Her lips moved, her voice silent behind the glass. I banged on it. How do I get you out? A deep, guttural chuckle echoed through the house. Turned. He was there. The man in the walls. But this time he wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes locked onto me. The forgotten ones. The souls trapped in this place. You cannot take back what was given. Asterisk. The air grew heavier, the walls closing in. And then, voice. Familiar. Go. Asterisk. Granny. Her expression was calm, her hand pressed flat against the glass. I shook my head, my throat tight with panic. No. I'm not leaving you. The man in the walls stepped closer. His grin splitting his face. You don't have a choice. Asterisk. The world shattered. Surviving the night in Granny's haunted house. A true horror. Part 5. The final nightmare. The shattered world. The moment the world shattered, everything dissolved into darkness. I felt weightless, like I was falling through an endless void, my screams swallowed by the abyss. Then impact. I hit the ground hard, my body screaming in pain. Cold, damp air wrapped around me, suffocating, oppressive. My vision swam as I pushed myself up, blinking against the dim, flickering light. I wasn't in Granny's house anymore. I was beneath it. The truth beneath the house. The walls were ancient stone, covered in strange, twisting symbols that seemed to pulse with something alive. The air was thick with rot, with decay, with something watching me. In the center of the room stood a massive, fractured mirror. Its surface rippled like water, and within it, I saw Granny. She stood on the other side, her hands pressed against the glass, her mouth moving in silent words. I staggered toward her. Granny! Hold on! But before I could reach her, the shadows shifted, and he emerged. The man in the walls. Only now, he was no longer just a twisted reflection. He was real. His skin stretched too tightly over his bones. his grin splitting his face in two. His hollow eyes glowed with something ancient, something hungry. "She belongs to me now," he purred. "And soon so will you." A desperate gamble. I backed away, my heart pounding. "There has to be a way to break this," shouted. "A way to get her back." His grin widened. "You can't take back what was given freely." Asterisk. My stomach twisted. Granny had pushed me through the mirror. She had chosen to stay. I shook my head. "No. There's always a way." The man in the walls tilted his head, amused. "Then make a trade." Asterisk. The shadows pulsed around me. The whispers of the forgotten ones slithered through the air. I knew what he meant. Could take her place. She could go free if I stayed. I looked back at Granny. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she shook her head. "No," she mouthed. I clenched my fists. I couldn't leave her here. I wouldn't. The last trick. My mind raced. There had to be another way. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And the man in the walls. He wasn't just a ghost. He was the heart of this place. And hearts could be destroyed. I turned back to the mirror. If this was his prison, then maybe it was his weakness. I took a deep breath. And I did the only thing I could. I raised my fist. And smashed it against the glass. The house fights back. The mirror cracked. A deafening screech ripped through the air as the entire house shuddered. The man in the walls howled, his form twisting, writhing. His grin finally breaking. I hit the mirror again. And again. The cracks spread like veins of light, splintering across the surface. Granny reached out. And suddenly, the glass shattered. A blinding light exploded through the room. The walls trembled. The shadows screamed. And then, everything collapsed. The escape. I gasped as I woke up. On the floor of Granny's house. The air was thick with dust. The wooden walls cracked and crumbling. The mirror was gone. And beside me, Granny. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion flickering across her face. I grabbed her hands. "We have to go. Now." She didn't argue. We ran. The house groaned around us, the walls splitting, the floorboards snapping beneath our feet. The front door loomed ahead, wide open. We burst outside, just as the house let out one final, shuddering breath. And then, collapse. The ground beneath it caved in, swallowing the remains into a gaping, endless void. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. The final omen. The morning sun bathed the world in gold. Birds chirped. The wind carried the scent of earth, of something real. I turned to Granny. "It's over." She didn't look at me. She was staring at the rubble. At something sticking out from the wreckage. I followed her gaze. And my blood ran cold. Piece of the mirror. Standing upright. And within its fractured surface. Shadow moved. Watching. Grinning. Waiting. The end. And some nightmares. Never really end.